Christian parenting.
I never tried to search for my birth mother because I didn't want to hurt my adoptive mother. I felt like if I asked too many, now looking back, I wish I would have asked so many more questions because both of my parents are now in heaven. But there's so many things I wish I would have asked, but I didn't ask a lot of questions because I was so afraid that would make them think that I wanted her instead of my mother.
Hey, welcome back, Called to Love families. I am so grateful to be able to spend the next few moments with you, and incredibly grateful and honored to be able to bring you practical, clinical, and always most importantly, the biblical aspects of the adoption and foster care callings. Today's episode is really special. I have a new friend and sister in Christ that I am just so honored to get to introduce you to. Her story is unbelievable and truly is a miracle. It began in danger and hopelessness, but it was carried by God's power and sovereignty. And the amazing thing is, He is still writing this story. So my special guest today is Niemah Scherlacher. Niemah, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much. I'm so excited. I've been able to dive a little bit into your story. You and I have been able to talk a little bit. You are an adult adoptee who came to the United States in a miraculous way. And you are in the process, even now as we're having this conversation, you are in the process of writing a book to tell your story. And it is just an incredible one. And so let's just dive in and begin with you just telling us a little bit about yourself now, and then we'll dive into what the Lord has done in your life.
Okay, well now I'm retired. I worked as a learning disabilities teacher consultant for almost 29 years up in New Jersey. And I've retired and just spend most of my time with my 6 grandkids and 2 more on the way.
I love that. That's such a blessing. And so the Lord's given you this time to be able to dive into just the treasures and the gifts of your family. And the story of your family is an incredible one that might not have happened without the Lord's intervention. So take us all the way back to when and where you were born, Niemah.
Well, my story starts in 1964 Jerusalem, and my birth mother was just 15 years old. She was Palestinian. She was from a small village up near the West Bank, the border, but she was in the Israeli territory. And she became pregnant at age 14, not of her choosing, and had to escape. And so she ended up in Jerusalem, where she was kept by the Ministry of Social Welfare and protected there. And then she gave birth to me. I was placed in a Jewish baby home called the Vitzo home. It's an orphanage, but they call it a baby home for some reason. And 2.5 years later, adopted by American Christians who happened to be stationed there at that time. My dad was in the Air Force, and he was stationed in Tel Aviv for 2 years.
Wow.
And the 2 years overlapping when I was in the orphanage.
That's so incredible. Oh my goodness. The Lord was, I mean, He had a plan all along. And just to give context for our listeners, back in 1964, what was the kind of the political state, the temperature between the different nationalities that you just mentioned?
Yes, that's a great question because tensions were very high between the Israelis and the Palestinians because the Israelis, obviously, they had their state in 1948, which meant significant displacement of Palestinians. A lot of tension, a lot of anger, resentment, boundary lines, literal boundary lines, barbed wire, curfews. And this was just, so 1964, that was just 3 years before the Six-Day War. So you can have an idea of how difficult tensions were, and yet in God's incredible divine intervention and orchestration, a big part of the beauty of my story is that while these tensions were taking place between the Arabs and the Jews, there's this quiet miracle unfolding underneath it all. And it was the birth of a baby, which was me. And part of my story, which I love to tell, and I've been telling my story since most of my adulthood, because though it's my story, it's ultimately God's story. It's a story of His divine intervention and His divine orchestration that He allowed Arabs, Jews, and Christians to work together for the safety of an orphan, a helpless orphan, in the midst of this division,
Yeah.
is just incredible. It can only be attributed to God's hand just
Yeah.
over me from the moment I was born.
Absolutely. It just gives me chills when I hear you share. I've read the words, but now just to hear you share it, it's just incredible. And let's talk about your birth mother for a little bit, and the situation that she found herself in, and just how the Lord protected her life to protect your life, and what that looked like.
Yeah, so it's kind of like what I knew before 3 years ago, and then what I came to know. What I knew most of my life was that she was just 15. I have very few documents, but one of them just kind of gives a background that she was the youngest of this large farmer's family. Her parents, her dad especially, just loved and adored her. And looking back, it was truly because of her father that when they found out she was pregnant, and in this letter, it even says that once the family found out, they did everything to protect her, knowing the vicious response from the community.
Yeah.
And her name, to show how God's hand was in this even before she was born, her mother named her Salima. Salima means to be unharmed. And
Oh,
so to think about how God established from the moment she was born, how her legacy, her name would become a legacy of her remaining unharmed in a culture that called for her honor killing. And and then by giving birth to me allowed me to be unharmed. And it just is, that's why this story cannot be told without consistently pointing back to God and
yes.
his hand upon my life, her life, from way back when she was born.
Mm, that is just amazing. So, talk about your childhood for a moment, because you referenced what you grew up knowing and then what you've come to discover, which I definitely want to get into in the course of our
Yes.
conversation. But for your childhood, you come to the United States, you're a young child. What did life as an adoptee look
Mm.
like for you and in your childhood? Were you aware of your adoption, and how did your parents navigate that? Let's unpack that a little bit.
Yes, I was very well aware of my adoption. I think because, so my parents could not have children themselves. So they had already adopted a little boy and girl from the States. They thought their family was done. And so I like to joke that they went to Israel and they just kind of picked me up along the way.
I love
Um,
that.
it was not planned. And so I grew up, my parents were very strong Christians. We grew up in a strict Baptist conservative Baptist church.
Okay.
So I was looked upon as this almost a celebrity, this little child celebrity who was born in Jerusalem, who walked the same earth that Jesus did. So for me, the story, I know I've listened to other podcasts of adoptees who sometimes say, oh, it's better to, not that you quiet the story, but just don't talk about the adoption so much because it might make the child feel different. But my difference was actually really celebrated. I clearly looked different because I had the dark hair, dark eyes. My hair was curly. Thank goodness for flat irons. And then my sister was blonde hair, blue eyed. My brother, brown hair, green eyes. So I clearly looked different. And often I came to say, when people would say you all look different, I would get to the point of just saying I was adopted, because I don't know how comfortable my brother and sister were talking about it.
Okay.
So for me, I think my story might have been different than a lot of people's in that it was just really cool. And so I I knew about my birth mother being very young. And so I at that time we didn't know the details of how I was conceived. We suspected, but we didn't have it known for sure. Um, we knew that she was rescued from, pretty much protected, that God's hand was upon her. So I just grew up knowing this, and so I didn't ever feel that sense of rejection that I think a lot of adoptees may feel, because I understood that my birth mother had no choice.
That's amazing. That's a really interesting perspective. And coming from an adult adoptee, and you do, it can be very divided, and every story is very unique, and we want to honor each of the experiences. But I'm so grateful to hear that you felt celebrated,
Yes.
and that made you feel valued as a part of the family, and understanding that this was God's design. Did you ever struggle with a grief over your biological mother, specifically understanding somewhat of the circumstances?
As I got older, I did. I think as I got older, I struggled with um, what she must have gone through. That she was a child herself,
Yeah.
what she must have gone through. Um, but somehow, I don't really know how to explain this. The brain is an amazing thing, because the idea of being adopted and what she experienced and all wasn't always at the forefront of my mind. I think I didn't allow it to be so present. I never tried to search for my birth mother because I didn't want to hurt my adoptive mother. I felt like if I asked too many, now looking back, I wish I would have asked so many more questions, because
Mm.
both of my parents are now in heaven. But there's so many things I wish I would have asked, but I didn't ask a lot of questions because I was so afraid that would make them think that I wanted her instead of my mother.
Yeah.
Um, so
I appreciate you speaking to that, and that's a great reminder for us as adoptive parents to be open and to maybe say it for our kids, like, hey, it's not going to hurt my feelings if you would like to talk about this.
yes.
That can be a really difficult thing maybe for some families. And especially when you talk about children who've come from hard places and there's not a lot of positive to be shared about the biological family's past. Do you have any advice for us in that, Niemah, specifically, if we know our child has come from a really hard place, whether it's been abuse, addiction, rape, all those different things, ways that we can be open with our children as adoptive parents, where they feel like it's safe to ask questions, but we also want to guard maybe hurtful information?
Yeah, I am a firm believer that talking about it is is crucial.
Yeah.
I listened to, I don't know if it was a podcast or I read that the fear of, if an adoptive parent brings a subject up, it will make the child think about things that they're not thinking about.
Yeah.
I can only speak as the adoptee. You're thinking about it. It's in there. And so I don't think an adoptive parent can bring up a subject, and obviously it's age appropriate also. I'm sure my parents, I don't recall to be honest, but I'm sure they did not share the details of my birth mother till I was older and could handle that kind of information. But I am a believer that to put those plant those seeds of, hey, I was thinking, and there's ways you can bring it up without directly,
Yeah.
just maybe it's a movie you watch and it reminds you of something, and you can bring it up. But I am truly a firm believer that try, and as the parent, I think it's more on you to initiate, because I'm not sure the child at teenage years especially, I don't believe they'll initiate, especially when you're dealing with issues of identity and who am I, and why did my mom give me up. um but I the thoughts are there, kids are
Yeah.
thinking about it.
Hey, Call to Love families. It is no secret that parenting is busy. Chaos happens before the morning coffee even finishes brewing most of the time, but that is why our friends at Christian Parenting created Morning Minute, a concise, scripture rooted daily email for busy parents. It's a quick pause at the start of your day. Each weekday morning, you'll get one verse to strengthen your spirit, one parenting insight grounded in Christ-like wisdom, one short action item to guide your heart and your kids, and one resource to help you go deeper. It takes just 3 minutes to read, but the encouragement lasts all day, and it's free, so you don't want to miss out. Subscribe now at morningminute.org to get this quick encouragement in your inbox every weekday. That's morningminute.org, or click the link in today's show notes. Yeah, I think that's great advice. And that's a perfect segue into my next question for you, is that question of the silent struggle. You said it's in there, and I think that's really profound. And so I don't want to glaze over that. It's in there. The questions are there. The struggle is there. And so you say yourself, you sometimes felt different and maybe struggled to belong a little bit. You kind of took the brunt of that adoption label essentially for your siblings because you physically looked different than they did,
Yes.
stood out a little bit more. And so, talk about that for us a little bit. Maybe what do we as foster and adoptive parents need to understand about those quieter identity struggles that our kids might be carrying?
Yeah, like I said again, it is definitely those thoughts are there. And I think it's important, even though I felt very celebrated in the Christian world, in the church world, where I felt those quote issues of adoption and identity was in the secular world
Okay.
because my name was very different. So that was an immediate, oh. And, nowadays I think we have a more variety of names. Unusual names are not so taken back. But when I was growing up, it was Niemah, and like I was made fun of. Kids, you know how kids are. They can make all different kinds of names. That so many people, even adults, couldn't say my name right, and I think what was really painful was my name being said wrong repeatedly by teachers, by people who saw me and had to say my name every day. I got
Mm,
to the point where I stopped correcting people.
wow.
And so I know that's just a small tidbit, but that's always something I've taken away as I'm looking back on my adoption is whether you're adopted or not, it is so important to learn people's names and say them right.
Yes.
Um, and, but I do think, I want to go back to the question you asked. You were asking about, I don't know if I went off subject.
No, you're right on, Naima. I think that's so important and helping like we want to advocate for our kids to feel seen. And so I think you
Yes.
make a beautiful point. So yeah, please continue.
What you just said is so important. Kids to feel seen. My working title for my book is actually, I wanted it to be unharmed, and then a Palestinian adoption story of secrecy, survival, and the sacred hand of God. But I actually think it's going to be the God who sees,
Oh,
because throughout my story I weave the story of Hagar from the Bible,
mm,
she is the only person in the Bible who named God, who gave God a name, Elroy, the God who sees. We all, and the premise is that, and again, it's for adoptees especially, but I think all of us as human beings, we want to be seen. And especially kids who are adoptees going through that struggle of who am I?
yeah,
And to validate them consistently that you are not just a child of God and he sees you, but he never takes his gaze off of you.
so good.
And the power of that and the comfort in that, and as a parent to reinforce that they are seen, and part of them being seen is to consistently try to reach in when you might think they're struggling,
Yeah,
and to bring those subjects up when oftentimes, as growing up as a child and as a teenager, they can't even put a name maybe to things that they're feeling.
that's right.
And that's where, as the parent, they need your help with helping them name, why am I, they might be lashing out in anger out of nowhere, and through talking to them, you may find out that somebody said something to them at school, or they saw a movie, or just something that triggered something in their heart that
Great.
made them feel unseen or unworthy or
Yeah.
less than because they're adopted.
Yeah, I think that's so good, Naima. It's so important, and you talk about name like that being a little thing, but no, I mean, the names that are given to us. I mean, God knows our name before He knew our name at creation, and there's such value to that. And we had a conversation recently with my guest Cynthia, and she was talking about being a namer of our children.
Mm.
You are this, you are blessed, you are beloved, you are chosen, you are whatever that is. And I even asked you before we hit record today what your name meant. You want to share that?
My name too. So my birth name, which is very interesting, my birth mother named me Nama. And in Arabic, Nama actually, it has a few different meanings, but one of them is flourishing, blessed. And I take incredible comfort. Of course, I'm making some assumptions, but I think we do that sometimes just to ease the pain. But that in all her pain and what she went through, she wanted to give me a name that meant blessing, to be blessed. And she wanted my life to be blessed, even though she knew she could not be the one to raise me and
Yeah.
be a blessing in my life. And
Yeah.
then my parents named me Niemah, which again, it has a few different meanings, but they wanted a name that was close to Nama. It's not a direct derivative, but it means pleasant, the pleasant one. I don't know that's always true, but and so yeah, so that's what they named me with
That's
that.
beautiful. I love that. I think that's just so important. And, I'm thinking through, just to your point earlier, ways practically that we can advocate for our children in those seasons. And something that the Lord's been kind to prompt me to do, just over the last few years. My daughter especially struggled with just severe anxiety, like crippling
Mm.
anxiety, and he has brought us so far. But I would purpose to send either an email or sit down with a teacher at the beginning of every school year and just kind of explain, like, here's what you're going to see in the classroom, and she's going to seem great. She makes a liar out of me because in the classroom she looks like she's thriving, but inside she's really struggling with a lot of things. And if you see this behavior, this behavior, this behavior, here's the root of it. It's fear.
Yes.
And so, that's a practical way that we can advocate for our kids. Can you think of any others, just based on your experience, that you might counsel us as foster and adoptive parents to advocate for our kids and that greater community outside of the safety of our homes?
Yes, I think that's what you're doing with meeting with the teacher in prior is just so huge because often too, kids will hold it together at school, and
Yeah.
that's why you see so much when she comes home because they do hold it together, and I think that the church community, any community that you're at, I think when you're in social settings, even though you want to give them their freedom, of course you're always just kind of keeping a second eye because again you just have no idea what somebody, even not meaning to say something cruel or mean or hurtful,
Yeah.
something that can come out, and that then you have the opportunity to be able to talk to your child about that when you're in, in the safety of the home. But I think that is so important what you shared is those almost a preemptive,
Yeah.
um, going ahead, a step ahead when you know they may be in a setting that could be vulnerable. And especially if they're struggling with things that you're seeing at home, like in your case, you mentioned the fear and the anxiety. I think so much adoptees probably struggle with that, just desperately wanting to fit in and
Yeah.
feeling like they're different.
Yeah, no, that's really great. I appreciate you affirming that, and it's because we're just learning. And I think we need to be reminded as adoptive parents, especially, like, we're trying, so that's winning. Like, we're being
Yes.
intentional, and we're not going to have all of the answers, but just being present and advocating where the Lord prompts us to, and being sensitive to that. I don't want to leave this topic too quickly. Talk about kind of just some of the struggling in the teenage years. Do you feel like that was kind of just the normal, because we all kind of struggle with identity through those formative years, right? But do you
Yes.
feel like
Yes.
there was a time where you're like, okay, I kind of struggled with that, and you either overcame it or you just kind of put it somewhere else and got on with life?
No, that's a really good question. I think for me, the way I handled feeling different. Um, and I don't know how much of this has to do with being in an orphanage for 2.5 years,
Right.
because um, those connections in the brain that are being made through touch, being held, skin to skin, all of that, that I did not have. Um, I used to joke, but it's not a joke. Like I'd be in a conversation, and I don't know if you remember. This dates me, my age, but when Romania was conquered, and there were all those Romanian babies in the orphanages, and they're all rocking in the cribs,
Yeah.
self-soothing.
Yep.
And I know sometimes I would just joke and I'd be like, yeah, I don't, because I grew up definitely so independent. I think that area of touch was definitely an area. I even went to counseling for it when I was pregnant because I was afraid I would not want to be nurturing with my own babies.
Yeah.
And but that was not developed in my brain, and so there's only so much you could learn. But I also, as a teenager, and kind of my shtick was, I don't need anybody. I'm on my own, and just this little feisty. And I think that was a protective facade of of telling the world I don't need you, because I felt like I feel like that I don't want to call it a consequence of being in a crib for 2.5 years, but at the same time, though God can redeem anything, there are natural consequences of life too. Um, and and so I think I had to really learn, and through my husband, it's incredible what his patience. The Lord knew exactly the type of person to bring into my life, because he tried to work with me on, this isn't who you are. This isn't really who you want to be. This isn't healthy to just push everybody away and act like you don't need anybody. So it was kind of in those years of early college, that I really started to recognize some areas I had to work on that were probably the result of the adoption quote issues that I carried with me.
Wow, that's a really great point. And I appreciate you speaking to that because, yeah, it's not something that we just, oh, you're okay, let's go about life. There is that ongoing, and we are a constant work in sanctification, right? And
Yes.
regardless of our origins, we were all born into the brokenness of sin. But there are those natural consequences, as you're talking about, that affect how we view the world, how we interact with
Yeah.
it. And so for you to be cognizant of that and for you to be purposeful
Mm.
in walking toward healing and
Yes.
recognizing that you needed that so that that wouldn't be repeated for those that God had given you to nurture. I think it's just
Yeah.
really beautiful. And thank you so much for listening to Called to Love today. I love to hear from listeners, and so I would love to connect with you to hear your stories and answer your questions right here on the show. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram, send me a direct message, or send me an email at the link in today's show notes. I pray you have been encouraged by today's episode to walk in faith and continue to embrace your own call to love. Until next time, blessings, sweet friends.